2 out of 3 investments are all cash, no debt. We don't borrow anything, no mortgage. And 1 out of 3, the maximum loan to value ratio that I have told my investors that I will ever do in the future is 30% loan to value, which is the opposite of what most people do, where they go 70% loan to value, 30% equity.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owners Association, where real estate investors have found success since 1968. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group. This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. And RCB and Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com. Hello and welcome to episode 416. My guest today has over 42 years of experience in industrial real estate, and the lessons he's learned during that period are very timely in today's high interest rate environment. His experiences, especially during the Great Recession, have informed his investment approach to be hyper-conservative. Joel Friedland has secured over 2,000 industrial property leases and sales, totaling over $250 million in acquisitions. He's raised over $150 million in private capital, and most impressively, he structures most of his syndications without any debt. Joel, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brian. Nice to see you.
I was really struck by your background and experience. Why don't you just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in real estate over 40 years ago?
I started out as a graduate of the University of Michigan. I went to school there and I didn't love college. I didn't like class. It was a little boring to me. I took a lot of economics classes and it just sounded like voodoo. And I actually took a real estate class and I loved it. So I decided I had to go into real estate. And when I graduated, I found a family that's not my family that owned in Chicago where I lived. I lived in the suburb of Highland Park, a northern suburb. The family owned 84 industrial buildings, 6 million square feet, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And I literally cold called the company to ask for a job because I knew I wanted to get into the business. The father, whose name was Milt Podolsky, invited me for an interview that day. I met Milt, his 2 sons, Steve and Randy, and daughter Bonnie, and another guy named Richard who ran the company with them. And they welcomed me in. And let me tell you why. They, in 1981, when I started, had 10 vacancies in their 84 buildings. We were in a deep recession at the time, and interest rates were 17%, and companies were frozen solid. They weren't moving, they weren't growing, they weren't relocating, they weren't consolidating. They were just staying put. And they asked me, the first question was, what would you do to fill up our vacant buildings? And I said, well, as a kid, I had a landscape business, and I once got 70 lawns by cold calling my neighbors over a weekend and hired 40 kids to work for me cutting lawns. What I would do is I'd cold call, like I cold called you for the job, industrial companies and industrial parks, and I would ask the company owners if they were looking to, they were considering moving or would look at a building down the street. And I think by walking around in industrial parks, I can fill up your buildings. And they loved it. They said, you belong in sales. You belong as our real estate agent. So I took the job and I fell in love with it right away. And they were the greatest mentors in the world. They were so fantastic. And I learned everything about what we call B and C industrial. Small buildings occupied by manufacturers and distributors who make everything under the sun. Anything that you have in your office or your house or your car or your phone or your microphone, it's all made in industrial buildings. And so industrial is the backbone of the American economy. And entrepreneurial companies that occupy B and C buildings are the backbone of that.
What is a small industrial building? Like how many square foot would you classify that?
So we own 20 buildings at the moment. We used to have many more. We've sold off a bunch over the years. 20,000 square feet, 30,000 square feet, freestanding, single tenant. It's about geometry. Each building has loading docks, so you can move in raw material, make something on the warehouse floor. It's manufactured or assembled, and then boxed, packaged, and sent out through another set of docks. And that's the distribution of the finished product. So you name it, in a 10, 15, 20, 30,000 square foot building, it can be a food manufacturer. It could be, we have one tenant that makes exhibits for children's museums all around the world. We have one tenant that makes safety equipment for the welding industry. So we got all these tenants that make things, and they move into buildings and they can never leave because labor is the most important thing. They can't lose their people. If they move away, they lose their well-trained employees. And also they usually have big machines that make their product or that cut product or that do something to whatever they're making. And to pick up all these machines and move them would be terribly expensive. So we love small, I would call them like brick buildings. In Chicago, they're made out of brick. In some places, they're made out of tilt-up. The older buildings are brick. The newer buildings are very large, and they're all tilt-up or what we call precast concrete. You see them on the side of the tollways. You ever drive by those?
Oh, absolutely. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Amazon's in some of them, Wayfair, Target's warehouse. They're huge. They're 1 million square feet. We don't do that. See, pension funds have enough money that they can sink 100 million into a deal like that. Our average deal is 3 million.
You got hired to fill up 10 vacant industrial buildings. How did that go for you?
I filled up 9. There was still one.
How quickly?
Took 1 year.
1 year, and it was just cold calling and get in contact with people.
I was living with my parents. I was living at home, and I'd say to my parents as I was leaving after breakfast in the morning, so today, even though it's December 15th and it's 10 degrees outside, I'm going to park my car in an industrial park and I'm going to walk up and down the street and I'm going to meet every owner of every company on that street. And my parents, my mother was a therapist and my dad a psychologist, and they looked at me like I was nuts. You're going to do what?
Have you had to apply that mentality again throughout your career?
Yeah, we buy mostly off-market deals, and we find them mostly by door knocking.
Describe that. Like what kind of door knocking are you doing for industrial? How does that work?
Pretend, Brian, that you are the owner of a company. Let me paint a scenario for you. Your grandfather started a company, and in the old days, back in the 1920s, he was, let's say, a butcher at a butcher shop. And his white clothes got bloody all the time. So he came up with an idea, and he started making these smocks that you could wear around your neck that were made of a material that the blood wouldn't stick to. So he'd go around selling these smocks to other butchers. That was like his idea. And it would be really great. And then one day, his son went into business with him and said, "Dad, you're keeping blood off of white outfits. I have an idea. Why don't we sell them to hospitals and doctors and they can use them in the emergency room?" Now, all of a sudden, you're in the medical business. Now you're no longer in the butcher business. There aren't that many butchers left, right? They're in the grocery stores, but how many butcher shops are there? So you have to go with the times. So now the family starts selling these products to doctors who use them in the operating room. And what's fantastic about it, so these medical products would lead to different medical products. Hey, as long as we're making something that somebody wears while they do surgery, why don't we get into the glove business? We'll make medical gloves. And while they're at it, why don't we make something that you find in hospital rooms, like, let's say, the thing that you put the thermometer in, the little piece. So then they make these things. Lately, they've been making them mostly in China because it's very inexpensive. So what they do is they provide a way to manufacture products offshore. But then when they're made, they're shipping them back here and they have to package them and then ship them out to their customers because the Chinese factory doesn't ship to their customers. And then a customer might say to you, hey, Brian, I need something else. While we're at it, I need pillows. Now you're in the pillow business. And all of a sudden you've got $1 billion medical supply company, and it occupies with each product a different building in a different city. And they start buying companies in other cities from families that own other kinds of manufacturing operations. And all of a sudden, a company's got 40 locations and they're billionaires. Those are my tenants. That's how it works.
I'm sure. I mean, it strikes me that it's almost as much for you about the tenants and the businesses that are inside your buildings as it is about the real estate.
I love getting to know the tenants. It's so much fun. We had one tenant that was on Shark Tank in year one, and he makes protein bars. It's called Element Bars, and he occupies a 50,000 square foot building on the west side of Chicago. And we have a guy who started out as a chauffeur after he nearly died as a drug addict. He became a chauffeur and started hiring other chauffeurs and buying cars. And now he's got a chauffeur business in 700 cities around the world. He's the largest transportation company for high-end transportation. He's exclusive with NetJets and with Hyatt. And he was on Undercover Boss in season 6. So it's so interesting. These tenants are fascinating. And that's who occupies our building, pays our rent. So it's not like a tenant who moves into a multifamily apartment. What's different is, do they have a dog? Are they married? Do they have 2 kids? Do they have 1 kid? Are they empty nesters? So there's more of a similarity between the type of tenants you have in multifamily. Our people are all over the board.
How has that worked for you? You've been doing this for over 40 years. You started during a time when you said interest rates were 17%. You had what sounded like an 18% vacancy for the people you were working with. What have you seen as far as occupancy and trends over the years when it comes to this type of industrial?
Ceilings have gotten higher, and there are more loading docks, because the bottleneck or the choke point was always, how do we get more product into the building? And so eventually some smart developers and property owners and company owners said, well, if we made the ceiling higher, we could buy racks and stack higher and not increase the square footage, and just use forklift trucks to drive up and down the aisles to pick pallets full of materials from the racks. So they've gotten very tall. And they've also added docks, because docks are a choke point. If you can't get your products in and out, that's bad. And there's more maneuvering room for trucks to move around, because trucks are much longer than they used to be. Today, a tractor and trailer could be 75 feet long. You drive by them all day on the highway. When they approach an industrial building, it's very hard to maneuver a building like that into a loading dock where the truck is 4 feet off the ground and the building is 4 feet off the ground, and the truck backs right in against the 10 by 8 opening. And then there's what's called a dock plate between the truck and the building, so that the forklift truck driver doesn't fall into the crevice. And it's like a little bridge. It's about 4 feet wide and 4 feet long. And the forklift driver goes in and out of the truck, and there's a light that's lighting up the inside of the truck so he can see what he's taking out and moving. And so you've got to have plenty of docks. And you know what else you need is plenty of parking, because as companies grow, they may move into a building and have 16 employees. They're not going to move out for 10 years, but if they grow, they might have 36 employees. So there has to be more parking than there used to be. That's what I've seen happen over the years. And the buildings that we tend to buy now are sort of like a needle in a haystack, because we want the ones that have the highest ceilings, even though they're older buildings, the best loading docks, the best parking, and only really 1 out of 10 buildings that was built before 1985 or maybe 1995 have any of those attributes. So we turn down a lot of buildings because we don't like the specs. What we're afraid of is that when our tenant leaves, because it's a single tenant building, it's either 100% occupied or it's 100% vacant. And the minute it goes 100% vacant, you want it to be very desirable for the next tenant to want to be there. So when I walk somebody into a building with a very high ceiling and with lots of loading docks and plenty of parking, they can't contain themselves. It's like, this is wow. It's like, wow, this is because I don't see them that often.
Are you buying existing then only, or do you also develop and build your own?
No, I took my lessons from another Chicagoan who I respected very much, Sam Zell. He taught me do not build anything because that's a different business. You're in the manufacturing business when you build buildings. You're manufacturing buildings. When you're buying, you're just owning. You don't have to build anything. In fact, sometimes we buy a building and we don't even paint or carpet for a new tenant. They do it themselves. It's great.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com. If you're thinking of leaving your W-2 job and becoming a full-time real estate investor, one of the greatest costs you must consider is healthcare for you and your family. When I made this transition myself, I found the whole healthcare insurance process to be confusing and frustrating. That's why I'm glad I met Chad Creasy at RCB & Associates. Chad is a professional health insurance agent who helps real estate investors and small business owners understand and choose their best healthcare options. And best of all, his services are covered by the insurance company and won't cost you a dime. If you live in Michigan and are expecting a change in your healthcare insurance coverage for any reason, or losing employer coverage or transitioning into Medicare, then you owe it to yourself to contact Chad Creasy at rcbassociatesllc.com.
Going back to Sam Zell, did you know Sam Zell personally?
I didn't know him personally, but his lawyer was my neighbor where I grew up on Marion Avenue in Highland Park, 2 doors away, Shelley. And so I got a lot of Sam Zell lessons from Shelley, whose lawn I used to cut.
What about trends like occupancy? I mean, what are you seeing right now? I know industrial is one of the hottest asset class. I mean, is the hottest asset classes in many areas. Are you really seeing that on the ground right now?
Yeah, it's been amazing. Since COVID, it's exploded because as stores close, warehouses pop up to take their place. And also because of the supply chain problems that happened with COVID, companies figured out that they darn well better make products here onshore. So a lot of companies that did make their products in China with contract packaging are opening up facilities here in the States. And by the way, a lot in Mexico. That's called nearshoring because it's right near the United States. But onshoring is when it's brought onshore into Chicago, New Jersey, Nashville, all the big cities in Texas. There's a very low vacancy rate. The vacancy rate is now running about 4% in our market. And the typical vacancy rate during ordinary times is about 8 to 10%.
Has there ever been a better time for you to be an industrial than right now?
No, rents have gone up between 50 and 100% in the last 3 years. It's hard to tell. I become friends with my tenants. That's one of the biggest problems. And I've had to go to tenants who are paying $5 a foot and tell them why the rent needs to be $9 in their renewal for their next 5 years. And it's a very hard conversation.
Yeah, well, hard, but still good for you.
Yeah, it's good for my investors. My investors like it.
And let's talk about your investors, because one of the things that is really interesting is the way you structure your deals and your syndications to just either reduce the amount of debt you're leveraging or eliminate it entirely. Can you kind of talk about how you structure your investments?
2 out of 3 investments are all cash, no debt. We don't borrow anything, no mortgage. And 1 out of 3, the maximum loan to value ratio that I have told my investors that I will ever do in the future is 30% loan to value, which is the opposite of what most people do, where they go 70% loan to value, 30% equity. And I'll tell you the reason for it. In 2008, the recession that hit us, or whatever it was, the crisis, nearly killed me. I ended up feeling like I was going to lose properties to banks. I had 7 banks. I had 108 guarantees. And I ended up in a severe depression. I was just filled with shame for having brought investors into all these deals that I told them were going to be good, and they turned out to really be in terrible shape at that time. And I ended up on that couch. For anybody who's watching the video of this, I was on the couch and couldn't get off. And I had to go for psychiatric help. I had to go for counseling. I needed medication. I mean, I barely came out of my depression. And you've heard of people who have a depression mentality. I have a depression mentality. Never have another one. And the way to avoid it, my accountant puts it in a funny way. He says, when he talks to his other clients about investing in my deals, he says to them, picture your conservative grandmother who was in the Depression. That's who Joel is. He structures deals like a little old, very conservative, risk-averse grandmother. And people either like that or they don't. If someone wants to invest really safely for a decent yield with a long-term hold, because we don't buy and sell real quick. Because once we find a great building, why sell it? We just keep collecting the rent and paying our investors their 7 or 8% yield on an unlevered basis. Why would we ever sell that? So he kids around. He says, yeah, so if you want to invest with someone just like your grandmother, that's the way Joel structures them. He doesn't like debt. He doesn't like risk. And there's still risk, and there's still downside potential. I always open with a new investor with, I ended up on that couch in 2008. There's risks all over real estate. Anyone who tells you it only goes up, don't listen to them. They are wrong.
So, Joel, there's a couple things I want to land on in what you just said. The first thing is, during the low interest rate period that we've been experiencing for 10 years up until about a year and a half ago, how many people told you were crazy for not borrowing money at 3-4%?
Everybody. How many people? Everybody. They said, what do you mean? Real estate's a leverage business. Why would you not use leverage? I was on the couch. I don't want to be back on the couch. The surest way not to be foreclosed upon is to have no bank.
And pay your property taxes.
Right, exactly. But even the property taxes, if you ever get in trouble, you can still drag that out for 2 years until things improve. But the bank doesn't let you drag anything out. They may give you a forbearance agreement. I had a bunch of those back in 2008 and 9. But the biggest problem that I see, Brian, is that most very prolific real estate buyers who use a lot of debt do not understand the risk they're taking because they haven't been slammed like I was and like some others were. Some people came out of 2008 and didn't learn their lesson. And some of them are now in trouble again. They own office buildings. Rates went crazy. Office tenants don't want space as much anymore because so many people work hybrid from home. And they just didn't learn. They started buying buildings that, let's put 70% on this. Let's get 80% on this. And it just happens. There's cycles. It goes up and down. It's really risky to own real estate. It's not all unicorns and rainbows. And so we have to know how to handle the problems. And it gives us just a lot of staying power to have strong balance sheets and have that situation as opposed to the other. When someone used to say to me, you idiot, I'd say, okay, well, you don't have to join me. You can do your deals the way you've always done them. It's fine.
What was it back in 2008? What was it that helped you get up off that couch and kind of rebuild?
I had a very close friend who at the time was in his 80s. He was in his early 80s. His name is Nate Wagner. And he had been through many ups and downs. And I had breakfast with him every Saturday at a local restaurant for years. And when the bad stuff happened, I went to him and I said, I'm in real trouble. And he said, luckily, you got me as a friend. Because Nate was really successful through the recession because he had very little or no debt. And I needed to have help, both physically, with money and with ideas, but emotionally too. And his wife had recently passed away, and he was depressed because he was really missing his wife. She was a very special woman. And the two of us said, let's support each other. Let's give each other reasons to get up in the morning. And we started doing deals together. He started investing with me on an all cash basis in new deals when nobody else would. And we added some people to that partnership. We added a few others who were like-minded, and I created sort of like a network of support and people who were willing to take a chance again on a guy that got in trouble in 2008. We didn't lose our buildings in 2008, but boy, my letters to my investors every quarter were downers. Eventually it came back. Nate said, you just have to survive long enough. Nate is now 96, and he still is a big investor, and so are his 3 daughters and his grandchildren. And what he likes to say is, I like your deals because we can sleep well at night. And that's really the whole thing. We supported each other, and we still do. And I'm looking only for people who have the grandmotherly, let's do something really low risk together, as opposed to someone pushing to go take a lot of risk.
Right now, as we speak, I think there's a lot of investors who bought heavily over the past 2 or 3 years and find themselves in a similar situation to what you found yourself in 2008. What's your message to them? I mean, based on your experience and how you handled it, communicated with your investors, and just got through it, what would you say to those people right now who are going through a very similar experience?
I'll tell you 2 things. Number one, I have tremendous empathy for you if you're in that situation, because nothing felt good for a really long time. Couldn't get out of bed in the morning, but even worse, I couldn't sleep at night. There was a lot of anxiety. It was really rough. And the answer is you'll get through it. And the other thing is, maybe you should go to Gamblers Anonymous, because a lot of people who are in the real estate business, who are deal junkies and take a tremendous amount of risk, aren't that different really from someone who goes and sits at the blackjack table. The odds are not in your favor if you have too much debt and the market goes down or rates go up. So I compare it very much to somebody who's got a big portfolio with a lot of debt to the craps table. If anyone's familiar with gambling, you can have 7 positions on the craps table, and then someone rolls a 7 and you lose everything all at once. Owning a bunch of real estate with a lot of debt isn't that different. So there's a lot of the element of gambling in that. And my whole thing is, I don't gamble anymore. No gambling. I won't even gamble on the golf course. I won't buy a raffle ticket. I have just a firm line that I am not a gambler, and I will not gamble with my money or my investors' money in real estate. And that's why the no debt or low debt, because I compare that to being like the house. The house can't lose because there's no bank.
Aside from the issue of debt and having low debt or no debt, what other conservative principles are you applying to your investing and projects that you take on?
Great due diligence. I have 8 investors. Right now, our last deal we did a $13 million acquisition of a company, of a property where there's 3 buildings where they make fruit juice concentrate. The main tenant is called Tampico, Tampico, which is like $100 million company that sells fruit juice all over the world. And when we bought the property, I brought in 64 investors. And the main thing is that I have 8 of them that are my committee of advisors. Nate's on it. Steve Podolsky, my original mentor in business from 42 years ago, is on it. And I don't make any moves without all of them asking their toughest questions about what could go wrong, and the physicality and the condition of the roof and the condition of the underground pipes and the environmental and all the things having to do with the financial wherewithal of the tenant to stay in business. So my 8-person advisory group is one of my main things that is a way to keep the risk lower, because it's not just me saying, oh, in my head, it seems like a good idea. I've got a gut feeling. They don't do that. They don't buy that.
What gut feelings of yours have they quashed?
All of them. They said, if you've got a gut feeling and you can't back it up with reports and answers that are adequate for us to put $100,000 into a deal or $1 million into a deal, Your gut doesn't matter to us. What matters to us is your professionalism and your mitigation of risk and your projections of what the rent's going to be and whether it's actually within the market range. So I've got a pretty tough group of critics, and I think that's the best answer is listen to the smart guys on your team and make sure they ask the really tough questions.
What is your favorite hack or app?
I actually am a huge YouTube guy. I love watching videos about world politics, world issues, real estate. So I am on YouTube every day, at least for an hour, mostly when I work out on the treadmill. And I bring my little iPad down there, and I think there's so much that can be learned from other people who know things that we don't know. It's great.
How would people find out more about you or get a hold of you or learn more about any opportunities that you have?
It's Brit Properties, BRIT1T properties.com. And on our website, we have an article that's called Why You Should Not Invest With Us. It's the 10 questions you better ask before you put your money with anybody.
Really love talking with you and just getting your perspective on how to, being conservative and acquiring properties with no or little debt and why you do it that way. And then just learning about your experience with industrial and how you approach it. You shared a lot of great insight today, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's HIG investor.com.